For 38 years, Tim Slatton kept a photograph on his bedroom wall. A team photo from his childhood football days. 12-year-old Tim in his uniform, and directly behind him, his coach. The man who gave him rides to practice. The man who checked in on the family after the murder. The man Tim and his brother had trusted and looked up to their entire lives. The man who had broken through his mother's bedroom window, raped her, and strangled her with a wire coat hanger, while Tim and his brother slept down the hall. He kept that photograph on his wall for 38 years. He had no idea. On September 4th, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton was found murdered inside her apartment in Lakeland, Florida. A palm print was lifted from her bedroom windowsill that morning. A rape kit was carefully collected and preserved. And then, despite everything investigators had, the case went cold and stayed cold for nearly 4 decades, while the man who killed her continued to live in the same city, continued to drive her surviving sons to football practice, and continued to ask them, quietly, casually, how the investigation was going. In December 2019, Joseph Clinton Mills, 58 years old, was arrested for Linda Slayton's murder. Genetic genealogy, a palm print from 1984, and a piece of used adhesive tape pulled from his trash had finally connected him to the rape kit that had been sitting in an evidence box since 1981. Tim Slatton looked at that photograph on his wall the day the arrest was announced, and finally understood what he had been living with. "I had a picture in my house ever since then," he said, "and never knew it was him. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. To understand what happened to Linda Slayton, you have to understand what Lakeland, Florida looked like in the summer of 1981, and what Linda's life looked like inside it. Lakeland sits in Polk County, roughly halfway between Tampa and Orlando, in the flat interior of the Florida Peninsula. In 1981, it was a city of about 50,000 people, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and where a football coach driving kids home from practice was considered a normal, generous thing for a community member to do. Phosphate mining and citrus packing were the backbone of the local economy. The city was quiet and working class. It was the kind of place where people trusted each other. Linda Patterson Slayton had been born on March 8, 1950. She was 31 years old in the summer of 1981. She was a single mother raising 2 boys, Jeffrey, who was 15, and Timothy, who was 12. She had moved the family to Lakeland just weeks before the murder, settling into apartment 31 at 303 Brunel Parkway, a Lakeland Housing Authority complex. It was a modest place. Money was tight. Linda was doing her best by her boys in the way that people do when they don't have much to work with, but refused to let that stop them. Friends and family remembered her as devoted. Her boys remembered her as someone who made their world feel stable and safe, even when circumstances were difficult. Jeff Slatton would later say that his mother was everything to him and his brother, the center of their world, the person who held the whole structure of their lives together. Tim was 12 years old. He played youth football with the Lakeland Volunteers, and his coach, a 20-year-old man named Joseph Clinton Mills, who worked at the Publix dairy warehouse and volunteered his time with the team, had been giving Tim rides to and from practice because the family didn't always have reliable transportation. On the evening of September 3rd, 1981, Mills picked Tim up for football practice, ran the session, and dropped the boy back off at 303 Brunel Parkway sometime around 8:30 in the evening. Linda Slayton came out to the car to thank the coach for bringing her son home. Mills later told police he left immediately and did not return. He was lying. On the morning of September 4th, 1981, Linda Slayton's sister, Judy Butler, walked to her sister's apartment to see if Linda wanted to meet for coffee. She knocked. No answer. She started to walk back toward her own apartment, but something made her stop. She turned around. The bedroom window screen had been torn open. Judy called for help. A maintenance worker named John Allen alerted authorities. At approximately 8:35 in the morning, Lakeland Police Department officers arrived at 303 Brunel Parkway, apartment 31. What they found inside Linda's bedroom was a scene of brutality that would stay with every person who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Linda was partially clothed, lying in her bed. A wire coat hanger, taken from her own closet, had been twisted around her neck. There was no forced entry at the front door. The killer had come through the bedroom window. The screen had been removed. The window was not locked. Veteran Sergeant Edgar Pickett led the Lakeland Police Department's crime scene unit. He was 53 years old at the time, just a year from retirement, and by every account, a meticulous and experienced investigator. He dusted the bedroom for prints, methodically, thoroughly, working the room from the walls down to the floor. On the bedroom windowsill, the point of entry, he lifted a palm print. He didn't know it yet, but that palm print was the most important thing he would find. The medical examiner performed an autopsy at Lakeland General Hospital. Linda had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. Vaginal swabs and semen samples were collected and preserved in a rape kit. Standard procedure, done carefully, filed away. In 1981, DNA profiling as we know it today did not exist. There was no way to run that evidence against a database of suspects. The rape kit would sit in storage for decades. Jeff and Tim Slayton were woken up that morning by police officers and told their mother had been murdered. Tim, still in his pajamas, walked past his mother's bedroom doorway. An officer swung the door open. He saw everything. "I saw the whole crime scene right then and there as a 12-year-old kid," Tim said decades later, his voice still carrying the weight of that morning. "You can't unsee it. I still see it, that image. A 12-year-old boy in his pajamas, seeing his mother's body in her bedroom, is where this story begins." And it would be 38 years before Tim Slayton got the answer he deserved. In the days immediately after Linda Slayton's murder, Lakeland police investigators moved quickly. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed witnesses. They built a list of persons of interest and began working through it. They questioned Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, a man with a documented history of abuse toward Linda. He became an early focus of the investigation. Detectives questioned him repeatedly. Nothing conclusive came back. They questioned other men in Linda's life. They questioned neighbors. They followed every thread that presented itself. They also questioned Joseph Clinton Mills, Tim's football coach, 3 days after the murder. But the interview was conducted over the phone, not in person. It lasted only a few minutes. Mills told investigators he had dropped Tim off the night before, that Linda had briefly come out to thank him, and that he had left and not returned. He said he had met Linda Slayton once. He denied any further contact. Investigators noted the conversation and moved on, Mills was never considered a suspect. He was simply a community volunteer who had given the boy a ride. Nothing about that phone call raised a flag. The rape kit DNA could not be matched to anyone in the law enforcement databases of 1981, because those databases barely existed yet. The palm print from the windowsill was cataloged and filed. The evidence was preserved with care, a decision that would matter enormously decades later. But the leads had run out. The Slatton case went cold, and Joseph Clinton Mills, 20 years old and apparently undetected, continued driving Tim Slayton to and from football practice. He continued picking the boy up, dropping him off, asking, with what Tim would later describe as almost casual curiosity, whether there was any news of the investigation, any new leads, anything the police had found. He was asking a 12-year-old boy to keep him updated on the investigation into his own crime. He wouldn't ask questions about it specifically, Tim recalled later. He just, well, any new news or any new leads? And I was like, no, nothing. The Slayton brothers grew up. Jeff finished high school, found work, built a life. Tim finished school, got married, started a family of his own. They stayed in contact with the Lakeland Police Department through every change of detective assigned to their mother's case, through every transition, every new lead that went nowhere, every anniversary that passed without an answer. No matter how many detectives we had to go through over here, Tim said, we were going to let them know. We're still here, and we want to know who killed our mom. The case was never formally closed. That matters. It sat in a filing cabinet as an open homicide, and every detective who inherited it understood that a family was still waiting. In 1998, Detective Brad Grice took over the Slayton case. He sent the unidentified DNA from the rape kit to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Major Crime Lab. A full DNA profile of Linda's killer was developed from the sample, a complete genetic picture of an unknown man. Grice collected DNA from prior persons of interest and had them compared to that profile. None matched. In 2001, around the 20th anniversary of the murder, Grice met with the Slayton brothers at the Lakeland Police Department to update them on where things stood. They had a profile. They had no name. They were still looking. In 2014, Lakeland Police established a dedicated cold case homicide team. 3 years later, in 2017, a detective began a comprehensive review of the Slayton file. Everything was re-examined. And then, in November 2018, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement called. They had a question. Were investigators interested in submitting the Slayton crime scene DNA to Parabon Nanolabs for additional testing? They were very interested. Parabon Nanolabs, based in Virginia, was at the forefront of what investigators were calling forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had only recently become viable as a tool for law enforcement. The principle was straightforward, but the execution was complex. Take an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene, upload it to a public genealogy database where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily submitted their own genetic information to learn about their ancestry, and look for matches. Not necessarily direct matches to the suspect, but matches to relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins. From there, forensic genealogists built family trees. Starting from those distant relatives, they worked backward and forward through generations, mapping out who lived where, who was the right age, who was male, who was in the right place, at the right time. It was painstaking, detailed, often time-consuming work. In December 2018, the DNA from Linda Slayton's rape kit was sent to Parabon. The lab began its analysis. Months passed. In June 2019, Parabon issued its report. The results pointed to one man. Genetic connections had been found to both sides of his family tree. He had lived in close proximity to the crime scene in 1981. He matched the age range. His name was Joseph Clinton Mills. Detective Tammy Hathcock of the Lakeland Police Department's Cold Case Unit read the report. She ran Mills through the case file. She went back to the original 1981 investigation records. And then she found it. The 3-day after the murder phone call. He had been in the file the whole time. I remember grabbing that piece of paper from the report and just running down the hallway to my sergeant saying, "Oh my God, he was interviewed." He was interviewed, Hathcock said later. Detectives Hathcock and Hurley knew that Parabon's genetic genealogy findings were powerful, but not by themselves sufficient for a prosecution. They needed to independently confirm that Joseph Clinton Mills was the man who had been in Linda Slayton's bedroom on the night of September 3rd and 4th, 1981. In 1984, 3 years after Linda Slayton's murder, Joseph Mills had been convicted of grand theft in Lakeland. He had forged a will. He never went to prison for it, but he was fingerprinted and palm-printed at the time of that arrest. In August 2019, investigators pulled Mills' 1984 palm print and compared it directly to the palm print that Sergeant Edgar Pickett had lifted off Linda Slayton's bedroom windowsill 38 years earlier. It was a match. A 94-year-old man named Edgar Pickett, who had spent his career as a fingerprint expert, whose name was on the crime lab at the Lakeland Police Department, who had worked the Slayton scene on September 4th, 1981, had collected the evidence that would eventually identify a murderer almost 4 decades after the fact. The genetic genealogy said Mills. The palm print said Mills. Now the detectives needed a fresh DNA sample. They put Mills under surveillance. They waited, and then they went through his trash. Detectives recovered several items from the garbage bags outside Mills's home: cotton swabs, adhesive patches, a colostomy bag, a plastic spoon. Among them was a piece of used medical adhesive tape. The lab extracted DNA from the adhesive tape. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA from Mills' medical tape matched precisely, definitively, without ambiguity, the unknown DNA profile that had been sitting in Linda Slayton's rape kit since September 4th, 1981. 3 independent lines of evidence now pointed at the same man: the genetic genealogy family tree. The 1984 palm print matched to Pickett's 1981 windowsill lift. The fresh DNA from the trash matched to the 1981 rape kit. There was no room for coincidence. In early December 2019, detectives Hathcock and Hurley brought Mills in for questioning. He initially denied everything. He said he had only met Linda Slayton once. He said he had never been inside her apartment. He swore to it. 8 days later, he was arrested on 2 counts of perjury for lying under oath during that initial interview. After his arrest, with his Miranda rights read and the weight of the evidence against him becoming apparent, his story changed. Mills told investigators he had gone back to the Slayton apartment after dropping Tim off. He admitted he had entered through the bedroom window. He told investigators, in clinical and disturbing detail, how he had twisted the hanger tighter and tighter He told them Linda had lost consciousness. He told them he had left through the same window he had entered. Mills admitted that Linda Slayton never regained consciousness prior to him leaving through the window, investigators wrote in the arrest affidavit. On December the 12th, 2019, Joseph Clinton Mills was formally charged with first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary with assault and battery. Tim Slayton learned about the arrest and walked to the football team photograph he had kept on his wall for 38 years. "I've been carrying the killer's picture in my house this whole time," Tim said, and never had a clue. Joseph Clinton Mills entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and sexual battery. On February 9th, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in Florida State Prison. He would never leave prison. At the sentencing, Linda Slayton's family confronted Mills directly. Her sons, who had spent 38 years without an answer and had never stopped pushing the Lakeland Police Department to keep working the case, stood in that courtroom and finally said what they had been waiting nearly 4 decades to say. Jeff Slayton had spent 38 years as a person of interest himself in the early years of the investigation. Detectives had questioned him repeatedly. He had lived under that shadow while also grieving his mother. When Mills was convicted, Jeff said what many people felt. "He's a cold-hearted monster, that's for sure." The bittersweet dimension of the closure was that their mother and their sisters were no longer alive to hear that justice had been served. They had waited too. They would never know. The first is the football photograph. Tim Slayton kept that team photo in his home for 38 years. He had placed it there as a 12-year-old boy who looked up to his coach. The photograph was a piece of his childhood. It was also, without him knowing, a portrait of his mother's killer. The intimacy of that detail, the way the killer had placed himself into the fabric of the surviving family's life, had continued their relationship, had accepted the trust of a grieving boy and used it to monitor the investigation, is one of the most disturbing elements of this case. The second is Sergeant Edgar Pickett. He was 53 years old when he worked the Slayton crime scene. He dusted that bedroom methodically, worked the floor, and lifted a palm print from a windowsill that no one could attach to a suspect at the time. He retired. Decades passed. And then that palm print, his palm print, became the independent confirmation that locked the genetic genealogy findings into an irrefutable case. Edgar Pickett was 94 years old when the case was solved. His name is on the crime lab at the Lakeland Police Department. He lived to see it. The third is the rape kit. Linda Slayton's rape kit was collected on September 4th, 1981, and preserved carefully for 38 years. It was not discarded when the case went cold. It was not lost in a transition between detectives. It sat in storage, preserved, waiting for the technology to catch up to the evidence. Evidence preservation is a choice, an active, ongoing choice. That choice made this case solvable. The fourth is the phone call. 3 days after Linda Slayton was murdered, investigators called Joseph Mills and spoke to him briefly over the phone. He was never questioned in person. He was never considered a suspect. For 38 years, the answer was in a brief, inadequate phone call. In-person interviews of everyone connected to a victim, not phone calls, need to be the standard, not the exception. Linda Patterson Slayton was 31 years old on the morning of September 4th, 1981. She had moved to Lakeland just weeks before with her 2 boys, trying to build something stable in a city where she didn't yet know many people. She trusted the community around her. She thanked her son's football coach for giving Tim a ride home. She went to bed that night in her apartment at 303 Brunel Parkway. She did not wake up. Her sons grew up without her. They kept calling the Lakeland Police Department. Through every detective who cycled through the case, through every year that passed without an answer, they kept calling. They kept showing up. They kept saying, "We are still here, and we want to know who killed our mother." That persistence mattered. Cases do not stay active for 38 years by themselves. Someone has to keep pulling on the thread. The Slatton brothers pulled on it for nearly 4 decades, and that pressure, that refusal to accept that the file was final, kept the investigation alive long enough for the technology to arrive that could solve it. Joseph Clinton Mills is in Florida State Prison under 4 consecutive life sentences. He will die there. Tim Slayton removed the photograph from his wall. "I looked up to this guy," he said, "and I had a picture in my house ever since then, and never knew it was him." He knows now. 3 lessons this case leaves behind. Lesson 1. Evidence preservation. Rape kits and physical evidence from cold cases must be treated as permanent assets of an investigation, not as paperwork to be archived and forgotten. Linda Slayton's rape kit was collected in 1981 and preserved for 38 years. That single decision to keep it, maintain it, make sure it survived every transition is the reason the case was solvable at all. You cannot predict what technology will be able to do with evidence in 10 years, 20 years, or 38 years. Keep it. Lesson 2. Interview standards. Joseph Mills was questioned by phone, briefly, 3 days after the murder, and never followed up with in person. That single procedural gap, a phone call instead of an in-person interview, gave him a window through which he walked free for 38 years. Investigators working murder cases must interview every person connected to a victim in person, face-to-face, formally. Not over the phone, not briefly. Lesson 3. Family persistence. Tim and Jeff Slayton called the Lakeland Police Department through every detective who cycled through their mother's case. They showed up. That persistence communicated to every detective who inherited the file that there were people still waiting. Families of cold case victims who maintain contact with investigators, who refuse to accept silence as an answer, who keep showing up, are part of what keeps those cases from going permanently dark. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. We cover the cold cases that were finally solved every single week.